It is my great pleasure today to introduce my colleague, Laure Resplandy, who's a professor in the departments of geoscience and also at the High Meadows Environmental Institute. Laure is in biogeochemical oceanographer, or rather an oceanographer. She studies biologically active chemicals and their interactions with physics and life, the exchanges between the atmosphere, ocean, and also land and ocean, and does this using a range of models that she either adopts or actually develops, and as well as observations from a wide range of sources, in situ, satellite, etc. Laure is sort of well regarded around the world, involved in large international assessments of the fate of carbon on our planet, is creative in the use of models and observations and bringing them together, and is leading to great insights. And so I'm just going to let Laure talk to us and explain the facts, fluxes, and fictions about ocean carbon. So thank you, Laure.
Thank you, Gabe. Danny, do you want to help me with the presentation? Thank you, Gabe. I'm happy to be here. And so, yes, I'm an oceanographer. My work is on how the ocean impacts climate, the climate system, and how variability in the system in turn impacts the ocean, the circulation, the ocean ecosystems. And the focus of my group is working on carbon and oxygen cycles in the ocean, but also how they interact with the atmosphere and the land. So today I'm going to talk about carbon, facts, fluxes, and fiction. So why do we care about the ocean? Well, the ocean supports life and the livelihood of about 3 billion people. It provides food, jobs with like fisheries, shipping industry, tourism. You have also coastal vegetation provides protections against storms. The ocean biodiversity provides, benefits for medical discovery. Today, most of the drugs that are nature-based, that come from nature, are from the land organisms, but the frontier now is with the ocean biodiversity to find new drugs for anti-cancer antibiotics. The ocean also regulates climate. It absorbs 90% of the human-driven warming. So it regulates climate. It absorbs 90% of the human-driven warming, 25% of our carbon emissions, and it's identified as a potential key player for climate mitigation and solutions, and I'm going to talk about this. But one of the challenges with carbon in the ocean is it's like a puzzle. So there are very different, very diverse forms of carbon in the ocean. I hope you can see my pointer, but you have carbon that is dissolved in the water. You have carbon stored in the biomass of a myriad of different, like bacteria, phytoplankton, zooplankton. You have carbon stored in the biomass of bigger animals like fish that we take out of the ocean. And we also have carbon stored in mangroves or vegetation, coastal vegetation. And those carbon pools are studied in very different ways. And these are just a few examples of the way that we look at carbon. So this is a picture from Bestwood's lab where if you want to measure carbon dissolved in the ocean or in bacteria and phytoplankton, you go at sea, you take samples, and then you can analyze them, do genomics on it. If you want to measure the mangroves, then you would need to go out there and put chamber fluxes where you measure the fluxes between the soil and the vegetation and the atmosphere. And another way, and that's what we do in my lab, we take models of the ocean, of the climate system, and we look at how different processes interact at regional or global scale. And so those different lenses are very different. They look at different things, and they look at different spatial and temporal scales. So one of the big challenges is to make a global carbon perspective out of those like fragmented and different lenses. And that leads often to misconception in both the, that fragmentation of the lenses leads to misconception in the public and the scientific discourse. And so I'm going to give a few examples of those common misconceptions. This is one that I think I see almost like every week, maybe last, but about whales and animals and the fact that they would act as carbon sinks, meaning they would offset carbon emissions, human carbon emissions. These are quotes from press release. So want to save the planet, saving whales could help. Why elephants, otters, and whales are nature's secret weapon against climate breakdown. Fish, an invisible carbon sink, threatened by fishing and climate change. So it's really the idea that that biomass takes up carbon and offset our emission. And so we're going to look into that.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to use this for now.
Oh, sorry. You haven't been hearing me all along? You have to tell me. Okay. Another misconception is about fishing and bottom trawling. So bottom trawling is a fishing technique where you drag, but now I don't have my hands. So you drag the seafloor to get a few key species, and one of the concern with that technique is that it resuspends sediments the carbon in that sediment can be transported and then maybe released back to the atmosphere. So that's a quote. Carbon released by bottom trawling too big to ignore. And so one of the questions is how big is it compared to other fluxes? Another misconception, and that's related to the whale one, but it's a more general form. And this one is like really, really common and pervasive in the community. It's the belief that biological activity controls the ocean sink of anthropogenic carbon. And this is a quote from a recent beautiful documentary, but that sentence is just wrong. Phytoplankton remove about a third of our carbon emissions. So we're going to talk about that too. And finally, another misconception, the ocean nature-based solutions, so climate solutions in the ocean that are biologically based, are highly effective to offset emissions. And here that quote is about blue carbon. So blue carbon, I'm going to talk a lot about blue carbon. This is coastal vegetation, so it includes mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses, and seaweeds. And the hidden CO2 sink that pioneers say could save the planet. I don't know who the pioneers are, but okay. So last fall, I was on sabbatical. Thank you, Princeton and École Normale for giving me that opportunity. And I was working with Marina Levy and Laure Resplandy, and we were talking about those misconceptions that keeps cropping up and that we see very often. And we realized that there was not one place where all those fluxes, all that information about carbon was at the same place, like fish, mangroves, carbon, air sea flux, dissolved in the ocean, biomass. And so we decided to kind of connect those different pieces of the puzzle and try to disentangle the facts from fiction and see, what matters. And so today, I'm going to talk about some misconception, and the thread around on those misconception is the fact that they reduce ocean life to carbon, and they overlook, other things like biodiversity, intrinsic value. I'm going to talk about 3 fiction that are related by that thread. The first one, whale and fish act as carbon sinks. Ocean ecosystems control the ocean carbon sink. And then we're going to talk about nature-based solution to offset emissions. And finally, I'd like to discuss, should carbon shape the scientific and public discourse for ocean life? So carbon is important and we should talk about it, but when we talk about ocean life, does that make sense? So a concept that I'm going to keep referring to is the ocean sink, the ocean carbon sink. So what is the ocean carbon sink and how does it fit in the global carbon cycle? So this is kind of the state of the art in terms of global carbon cycle. This is an effort that is published every year. This is the Global Carbon Project. And, as a function of time, you have here how the global carbon cycle is perturbed by humans. And so this is emissions. And so you see today's our emission are about 10 gigatons of carbon. In the last decades, about 80% is fossil carbon and about 20% is coming from land use, so deforestation. And then the question is, where is that carbon going? And so this is really a mirror image. Everything that is emitted needs to go somewhere. So you see that about 45% stays in the atmosphere, it accumulates in the atmosphere. 30% goes in the land, and that's what we call the land sink, and then 25% in the ocean. And so the ocean sink is really the fraction of CO2 emitted by human activities that is absorbed by the ocean. And that concept links to what is nature baseline and what is the human perturbation. And I'm going to take here like an analogy, an example. As human, most of us, when we're at rest, we have kind of 60 bits per minute. And then if I run and my current state, my new state is 160 bits per minute. It's actually that 160 is my baseline plus the perturbation of 100 bits per minute. And for the ocean, it's the same. The ocean has a pre-industrial baseline. Actually, before human activities, the ocean was losing carbon to the atmosphere. And that's because their rivers bring carbon. So on land, terrestrial ecosystem, before human intervention, take up carbon. That carbon flows down rivers, goes to the ocean, and then it's released back to the atmosphere and back, and you have a river loop, like a natural river loop that happens before humans. And then you have the human perturbation, which is, mostly the ocean sink, and it's about 2.7 gigaton of carbon per year, and that adds to that baseline. And so today, the ocean flux is about 2 gigaton of carbon per year, which is actually the sum of that baseline plus the perturbation. And all through the talk, I'm talking about gigatons of carbon. This is 10 to the 15 metric tons, 1 million billion tons. It's a lot of tons, a lot of carbon. Okay, so where is carbon in the ocean? 99.9% of the carbon in the ocean is non-living, and mostly it's dissolved in the ocean. And only 0.01% is actually living biomass. That splits between 35% of what we call blue carbon, and you can think about it, most of it is mangrove biomass, and then you also have salt marshes, seagrass, and seaweed. And 65% is that what I call marine biomass. It's the other type of biomass. And most of it is what I call small. It's smaller than a few millimeters, and it's plankton, bacteria, fungi. And the remaining fraction is larger, like fish and animals. And in that's where it stands. A very tiny portion, which is mammals, mostly whales. So this is carbon pools. So I'm going to talk about two things during that talk. I'm talking about pools, like the stocks of carbon, but I'm also going to talk about fluxes between those pools, between the ocean, the atmosphere, the land. So to understand carbon in the ocean, we often look at fluxes. And so a lot of what I'm going to show today looks a little bit like this. This is my ocean with my blue carbon pool, my non-living carbon, my marine biomass, the exchange. And then we're going to look at fluxes. I'm going to give you global fluxes. I'm going to give you, for instance, this is the main flux, air CO2 flux, about 2 gigaton of carbon per year. This is one global number, but actually, if you think, if you look at it, what it would look like in space, it would look like this. So it's actually regions where the ocean takes up carbon in blue, but also region where the ocean releases carbon to the atmosphere in red. And overall, if you average, you get that number, which is the blue wins. I'm also, showing uncertainties. That little symbol refers to an uncertainty. I'm not going to talk too much about uncertainties today, but they are there. Some fluxes are well known, others are more uncertain. Okay, so we have the air sea flux. That's the main flux. What are the other fluxes that matter? These are the three main fluxes. There are others, and we're actually going to look into them, but these are the main, like the first order balance. The ocean gains carbon by air sea fluxes, about 2 gigatons per year. Rivers, 1 gigaton of carbon per year, and it loses carbon through burial. Mostly the burial by open and coastal waters. This means burial of carbon related to that marine biomass. So marine biomass fixes carbon. Then when they die, that biomass sinks. Most of it is recycled in the ocean, go back to dissolved form. But some of it is buried, and that's that flux. What you see also is that today the ocean accumulates carbon. The gain exceeds the losses, and we know the ocean is gaining carbon. That's why we talk about an ocean carbon sink. So we're going to start from this, and then we're going to look into the other fluxes, fishing, trawling, how do they look like? Whoop. So, can only go forward. It's weird. Okay, our first fiction is whale and fish act as carbon sinks. And I'm going to extend that a little bit. Their removal by fishing or their restoration matter for understanding global carbon. And bottom trawling pose a climate risk due to large CO2 emission to the atmosphere. So we start from our three fluxes, rivers, air, sea flux, and burial. And now let's see fishing and trawling on top of that. Fishing, this is based on estimates of fish stocks and biomass and then converting to carbon. Trawling fluxes, it's based on mostly like observation, but a lot of modeling, like how much carbon is resuspended and how is it transported and how much would be emitted to the atmosphere. What we see is that those fluxes are small, 1 to 2 order of magnitude smaller than the air sea fluxes, the rivers, and the burial. And they are uncertain also, but they are small. Now, if we look at biomass, fish and mammal biomass, so you remember biomass is 0.01% of carbon. The marine biomass is about 6 gigaton of carbon. And within this, fish and mammal biomass is actually very small. We have fisheries, which are the fish that we actually harvest, are about 0.15 gigaton of carbon. Other fish, 0.45. Mammals, 0.004 gigaton of carbon. So their amount of carbon in the ocean they hold a very tiny amount of carbon. Now, if we think about how humans have perturbed those fluxes, those stocks, we see that whaling divided by 5, the mammal biomass, which means whaling took out 4 out of 5 whales. Fishing reduced by 40% fisheries biomass, which is the fish that we harvest. And bottom trawling, if we think about it, 3/4 of what is caught by bottom trawling is actually just thrown away dead in the ocean. It's not even sold or consumed because they just target a few key species. So if we think, if we go back to our fiction, whale and fish act as carbon sinks. Well, if we look at the facts, actually fishing, whaling, and trawling fluxes are very small. They are very minor influence of carbon. However, that's not what matters in that case. It's not about carbon because those fluxes have catastrophic impacts, massive impacts on ecosystems and those targeted pools and the societies and economies that rely on them. This is an image of what is going to be just thrown away from bottom trawling. All those things were caught in the net and they're just thrown back out. And another thing is that narratives that talk about those systems are often focusing on carbon as the primary thing, when clearly here this is more about the benefits that those ecosystems bring, not necessarily about carbon. So we're going to expand a little bit that to our fiction number 2. This is going to be the biggest one. Ocean ecosystem more broadly, blue carbon and other marine ecosystem control the ocean carbon sinks. And I'm also going to talk about where this misconception is coming from. And one point I want to convey is that biological fluxes matter. They matter for the natural baseline, but they do not control the ocean sink. Okay, so we go back to our figure with rivers, air, sea flux, and burial. But actually, what is the ocean sink here? Because you remember it's the CO2 emitted by human activity that is absorbed by the ocean. And so we need to account for that natural baseline and to get the human perturbation. So actually, we need to split that air-sea flux, you remember, into the natural baseline, the fact that the ocean, before human intervention, was losing carbon, to get the ocean sink, which is about 2.7 gigaton of carbon per year. Now, how does that, we're going to compare that number and link it to blue carbon and marine biomass. Let's start with blue carbon. These are the fluxes of blue carbon. So today, blue carbon take up about 0.3 gigaton of carbon from the atmosphere. And this is the sum of 0.4, which what they used to take before human intervention. And you see that actually they take less than they used to. And this is mostly due to deforestation. So this is a picture of mangrove deforestation, but salt marshes have been converted to agricultural land or urban areas for like hundreds of years in Europe. And in the US also, it's been a long time. And now it's more going to mangroves. But those systems have been cut down for a long time. And that's the magnitude of the changes. Again, those fluxes, you can see they are very small compared to the ocean sink. Also, those systems actually don't contribute to the ocean sink because the perturbation is not to take up carbon, but to release carbon back to the atmosphere. So those systems take up carbon, but they take up a small amount, and the perturbation is to release carbon to the atmosphere. Let's think about the other ecosystem, so marine biomass. One flux that they have is towards the burial. Again, here I split between, I split the baseline in blue and the perturbation in red, and you see it has slightly increased, and that's mostly because human dump fertilizers and wastewaters in the ocean, and so that boosts biological production in coastal areas, and that slightly increased the burial in the coastal sediments. Now, those fluxes are small compared to the ocean sink. They are not really, influencing the ocean sink. The next question, however, is, well, that ocean sink, is it related to the marine biomass? And that's kind of what is implied in that quote, phytoplankton takes up 30% of our emission. That would imply that marine biomass is actually driving that 2.7. So let's have a look at this. And for that, we're going to talk about ocean carbon pumps. So ocean carbon pumps are processes that store carbon in the deep ocean. You have carbon in the ocean, but actually you have more in the deep ocean than at the surface. They are called pumps as an analogy with sodium-potassium pumps that regulates fluxes on the membrane of our cells. That's why they are called pumps. So the processes that export carbon, you have the biological pumps. Carbon is taken up by organisms, by ecosystems. When they die, it sinks down or it's transported down by ocean circulation. Most of it is actually recycled and go to, remineralize, go to dissolve in organic carbon. A small fraction is buried. Those biological pumps explain 90% of that gradient, of the fact that you have carbon in the ocean, the fact that the ocean is a massive reservoir of carbon. The other process is the solubility pump. The solubility pump, you can think about it when waters travel poleward, they cool, they take up CO2 as they cool, and then the ocean circulation can take them down and they transport carbon down. And both of those pumps, by the way, have an upward transport, right? They have a loop, it's a natural system, and so you can think about it as kind of an equilibrium where you have transport down and up, but it results in that pumping of carbon. And so the solubility pump explain the remaining 10% of that state, the fact that the ocean is a massive reservoir of carbon. Now let's look at how are human perturbing this. What is the human perturbation? 2.7, this is our ocean sink going in, and actually virtually all of that is attributable to the solubility pump. And that's because when you increase atmospheric CO2, you increase the disequilibrium between the ocean and the atmosphere. You chemically push carbon in, and it's taken up and transported by the solubility pump. The biological pump is slightly, we think, affected. It's very small. It's hard to measure, but the impact is smaller. So the biological pump controls the baseline, controls the natural system, the fact that there is a lot of carbon in the ocean. But the carbon sink, the fact that when we add CO2 to the atmosphere, it's taken up, this is a chemical process. And that's because increasing atmospheric CO2 doesn't make phytoplankton grow more, basically. So if we recap a little bit, ocean ecosystem control the ocean carbon sink. The human perturbation to those biological fluxes is 1 order of magnitude smaller than the ocean sink. It's small. The ocean sink is controlled by the rise in atmospheric CO2 and the solubility pump, and those are chemical and physical processes at the interface. And where is that, a misconception coming from? Well, first, I think it is different from the land sink, and I think that plays a role because we probably tend to apply what we know on the land and assume it applies to the ocean. Because if you increase atmospheric CO2, you actually increase the growth of plants on land. But that's not the case in the ocean. The other thing is that there is that conflation between the baseline and the perturbation. Biological processes control the baseline, control the natural storage of carbon, but not the carbon sink. And I'm going to give another example of that I worked a lot on recently. and that involves rivers and blue carbon. And this is linked to how we refined the way we think about ocean and land sinks. So at first, like a few decades ago, the land and the ocean was seen as independent silos, and basically the sinks was estimated as the flux from the atmosphere into those systems. No baseline was assumed, like no fluxes that are natural was assumed. That was fine as a zero order, but when we started refining our estimates, it became clear that you need to account for the river, what I call the river pipeline or the river loop. The fact that the land, even before humans, was actually taking carbon. Part of it was leached to the ocean, it outgassed, and you had that loop of carbon. That means that the land sink looked bigger than it. If you ignore that loop, the land sink looks bigger than it is, and the ocean sink looks smaller than it is. And actually now we think about it even more, a little bit more refined. This is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to talk you through the main points. But the fact that actually you need to account not for one river loop, but 3 different river loops. And the way to think about this is to connect terrestrial ecosystems to the open ocean. It's actually not a river pipeline. It's not just one river pipes that goes from trees to ocean or soil to ocean. You actually have inland waters, so lake, ponds, streams. You have estuaries and tidal wetlands with mangroves and salt marshes. And then you have coastal waters, and then you go to the open ocean. So carbon gets reworked, transformed, buried, and absorbed along that path. And so what we showed is that you actually need to take into account the systems to understand how carbon, is partitioned between the land and the ocean, and how the carbon sink is partitioned. There is that, what I call the traditional long-range loop, that's that river loop in green that transfer carbon from terrestrial ecosystem to the ocean. But then there are also those 2 smaller loops. The upstream loop, and this one recycles carbon between inland waters and the terrestrial ecosystems. And a downstream loop, which kind of the uptake by blue carbon and coastal waters kind of offsets some of the losses by burial. So I'm going to just give you quickly a few numbers just to illustrate. But carbon leaches out, this is in gigaton of carbon per year again, but carbon leaches out of terrestrial ecosystems. Part of it is recycled, part of it leaches out and continues downstream, and then some of it is buried, some of it is outgassed by the ocean naturally. This is all natural loops, right? And then some of it is taken up by blue carbon, tidal wetlands, mangroves here. What are the implications of this? Well, ignoring that upstream loop basically leads to the overestimation of the land sink by 25%. Ignoring the downstream loop and blue carbon underestimate the ocean carbon sink and the storage in sediments. So it has implication in how we think about carbon sinks. And why do we care about this? Well, we're trying to know where carbon is stored because it actually matters. If it's in a forest, it can burn out. If it's in sediments and in the ocean, it's a much more stable sink. So it actually matters to know where carbon is stored. So if I go back here, the baseline and the perturbation, we've seen the carbon pumps. They explain the baseline in the ocean. But you also have rivers and blue carbon. They are, yes, small flux compared to the ocean sink, but actually that matters a lot to set the baseline again and to quantify those ocean and land sink and attribute where the carbon is going. Okay. The last fiction I want to talk about is the climate solution. Ocean biological climate solutions are highly effective to increase long-term storage of carbon, atmospheric carbon, and offset emissions. A concept here that is important is the potential of climate solution. What is it? It's the ability to fix carbon that would not be removed without intervention. So it's called additionality. In that case, you need to remove the baseline, but you also need to remove the fact that the ocean would take up carbon anyway, the ocean sink, right? It's really, you need to boost or have a geoengineering strategy that actually boosts the carbon sink. And I'm going to focus today on blue carbon here because this is the focus of the community is a lot on blue carbon. Why? Because those systems store in sediment 30% of the carbon that they take from the atmosphere. This is massive. Other marine ecosystems, it's more, a few percent. So they actually absorb carbon and store it in sediments, which is considered pretty stable. Also, that biomass was reduced by about 15%. This is an image, for instance, from marsh to farm from the Newark Meadows, where it was converted to agricultural land. Now today it's more mangrove that are converted. This is an example converted to shrimp aquaculture ponds. So loss of area. So what are those solutions that people are thinking about? And one of them is reforestation, is replanting those systems. Let's consider the scenario where we would completely reverse all deforestation. What does that mean? That would reverse that loss of 0.1. So complete reforestation of all blue carbon would, basically represent 1% of recent emission, 4% of the ocean sink. And why is that? Well, they have a large potential per meter square, but actually globally, they are limited in space. Like their coverage is limited in space. So what people are also thinking about is afforestation, planting more than what there is. It's hard to do on land because, or in mangroves, because there is competition with other things on land. But so people are thinking, for instance, seaweed farming, where, and to fight kind of that spatial limitation. So there is some work going on today to explore those options. One of the concerns is the uncertain fate of carbon. Like, is that carbon going to be emitted downstream? Also, those farms are associated with nitrous oxide and methane emissions, so you need to account for this, because if you take up carbon but you release other greenhouse gases for climate, that matters. What is the limitation? Why are those solutions limited? Is because they are biological, and we've seen the carbon sink is not biological in the ocean. So there are other, I want to highlight that there are other chemical solutions. There are other solutions that leverage the fact that the ocean sink is chemical. Here I'm giving one example. This is what is called ocean alkalinization. You mine, you extract minerals, you treat them to make quicklime. You need to store the carbon that you emit during that process. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to make it a climate solution. Then you transport to a harbor, you put it on a ship, you ship it somewhere, you dump it in the ocean, and you add alkalinity to the ocean. Alkalinity is the ability it's the ocean ability to buffer a weak acid. CO2 is a weak acid, so basically you're boosting the ability to take up CO2. And people think that, at scale, it might be able to take up 1 petagram of carbon per year, which is about 10% of our global emission. This number, I wouldn't, I think it's still up in the air, but, that's the scale we might be talking about. And here I'm just showing a result from that study where they show the cost per ton of CO2 that would be captured depending on countries. You see that you have similar patterns in the three with those purple areas, and those would be because of the chemistry of the ocean. These are areas where the ocean, if you dump alkalinity in there, it doesn't have time to equilibrate with the atmosphere. That alkalinity is just transported out of reach from the atmosphere, and so it's limited. Then you also see difference between countries, and that's because, the US and China have similar priced electricity costs on land. Like, all that process would cost similar prices, but Australia is a much more expensive energy. And so that would explain, differences between countries. I'm not going to go more into detail. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk more about this. But so the point here is, if we go back here, human perturbation of blue carbon ecosystem, again, has a minor influence in carbon. But again, that's not what matters here. What matters is the impact on those systems and the communities and the societies that rely on those systems. Nature-based biological solutions in the ocean show relatively low additionality, 1% of current emission, for instance. But there are maybe other solutions, in the ocean that can leverage the chemical nature of the ocean sink and have a higher potential. Okay, so I would like to finish with some discussion about those misconceptions. One thing that they have in common is that they equate biomass or ecosystems, biodiversity to carbon. And the question is, should really carbon be the metric here? Should carbon shape the scientific and the public discourse on ocean life? And I'm going to be a little bit provocative, if you're really by mass balance logic, actually, plastic pollution offset half of what we remove as fish. So carbon fish is replaced by plastic carbon. In terms of carbon, it's the same. But is it really the same? No. Okay, this is a little bit obviously provocative, but my point is reducing ocean life to gigatons of carbon is misleading and is missing the point. Human activities have had, so we've seen all those numbers before, but they have a disproportionate impact on ecosystem and biodiversity. Marine mammals divided by 5, fisheries reduced by 40%, salt marshes, seagrasses lost 30% of the area, bottom trawling throw away 3/4 of the catch, we have plastic pollution. And then the ocean sink, it's a great thing. It buffers climate, that's great. But that less than 1% increase in dissolved carbon leads to acidification, reduced some impacts also, reduced coral calcification, larval mortalities. I'm not going to go into the details, but there are impacts associated with this. So the question is, why is the carbon always the metric? Carbon makes sense in many contexts. When we think about warming, when you think about the carbon sink, it makes sense. But why are all those studies always linking that back to carbon? And I think it's because of that very strong results we have in the community. This is a figure from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, that present cumulative CO2 emissions, so the amount of CO2 that has been emitted since 1850, versus surface warming. And you see that near linear relationship. This is from observations, and this is projecting into the future depending on different scenarios. And you see that the different scenarios get a different level of emission, but they all align with that line. So you have a linear scaling. So that makes it very easy to go from CO2 to temperature to dollar amount, to kind of put a price on each ton of carbon. And, there are a lot of pricing mechanisms that includes markets, like compliance markets that are driven by regulation, like in Europe, voluntary markets, which are corporate sustainability goals, carbon taxes or social costs that estimate the social cost of warming on health, on infrastructure. And those systems are very valuable tools for high potential climate and carbon intensive or decarbonization solutions. But they are actually pretty ill-suited for ecosystems and biodiversity protection because they are not designed to do this. It's really about that metric. So thinking that you can do that with whales is kind of not making sense, to me. But, there is really a shift at the moment towards framework that emphasize biodiversity and their benefits and values. And the question is, why go to carbon? Well, because biodiversity is actually hard to measure. It's harder to quantify. Carbon is like you emit 1 mole of CO2 or 1 ton, it's just mixed. It's global, it has a global warming impact. Biodiversity is much more local. So it's difficult to measure, to standardize at global scale. But that's also an opportunity because it's an opportunity to highlight local impacts, local narratives, why we care locally, right? I want to emphasize, and I know there are others, but that's a recent effort from the Convention on Biological Diversity, where in 24 and 25, they've been putting up frameworks. They are starting to put frameworks that would subsidize and finance biodiversity over carbon. And finally, I've been saying, nature-based solutions in the ocean are not highly efficient for carbon offsets. However, we could see them as win-win solution because mangrove, seagrass restoration, ecosystem-based fishery management, they have co-benefits for biodiversity and economies, and they still align. They have a small impact, but they are not at odds with our climate and mitigation objectives. Okay, so these are my key takeaways. So I talked a lot about this is not about carbon, but of course it is about carbon because the ocean is a very powerful carbon sink, but it's controlled by physical and chemical processes. Now, a healthy ocean, you can ask, is a healthy ocean needed to mitigate climate? Well, a healthy ocean sustains life, health, societies, and economies, but it's not really biomass and whales and fish that control carbon and the carbon sink. Carbon is overemphasized in those narratives about ocean life protection and ocean conservation. It's about the benefits for the community, for health, for jobs, for food. And so there is really that need for new narratives and stop trying to always say it's about carbon. And then this is my last point about win-win. It's not that we shouldn't do some of those blue carbon restoration projects, but we should not sell them only for carbon because that's risky. Because if you sell them only for carbon, if you look at the numbers, you can say, well, maybe that I should do something else. Well, maybe for carbon, but for other, they should be, promoted for what they're good at, which is biodiversity, coastal communities, and the economy. And thank you.
So, is it on?
Great, 3 mics.
Hey, mine
Okay.
Mine is on, right? No?
Oh, because you need that one.
No, it's not.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Mine is on now?
You
Wait a
can speak loud.
Yeah, it is. That's on now. All right. So I'm going to sit down here. For those of you on Zoom, we have, I already see questions have been coming in. And so what we'll do is we'll have an opportunity to ask Laure questions. I would ask, we have people with mics in the audience, and I would prefer that our first question be from a student or an early career scholar. Laure just spoke for a while, so she has time to mellow out if you need to let your question state. Any brave students? There we go, Paul. Oh, we have two. Good. So we have Paul, and then we have somebody else that I don't see.
I was curious on the point of standardized metrics for biodiversity. Could you share at least a few candidates that have been suggested and what's working versus what's not, just so that we get a flavor for what's the state of the art currently?
Yes, so some aspect of biodiversity are relatively easy to relate to a dollar amount. So that would be the value of certain things, how much you can sell them. So, but then it comes down to how do you value other type of benefits, like that are less like mercantile, like a direct dollar amount. I think some of the I think it's really, first, I would say that they're in EEB, there are probably people that work more on that aspect than me. But you can see it as trying to, it becomes more regional and more like local, and what are the local value of those ecosystems or that biodiversity in terms of, for the ocean, I think it's more advanced on the land side. For the ocean, I think it's pretty new. And some of those framework, I mean, they're still working it out. The Convention of Biodiversity, on Biological Diversity, they are just, this is coming out right now. Like they met in February, and some of the first reports came out in February. So I think we're going to see more of this coming forward. Yeah.
There's another question.
Thanks, Laure, for that wonderful talk. I have 2 questions about geoengineering. One is when people talk about carbon removal from the atmosphere, if such technologies were somehow scaled up to take out a meaningful amount of carbon, wouldn't that also reduce the strength of the ocean carbon pump? And then how much would you have to account for that by taking out more the more you take out? And then my second question is, would this idea of dumping alkaline minerals into the ocean also affect ecosystems?
So for the first question, it's the idea that if you start taking up carbon with a strategy, then you would reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and so that would reduce the other thing, the sink, like the land sink and the ocean. So you would have a feedback. Actually, it's funny that you should ask that question. We were talking about that in my group meeting yesterday. There are 2 papers that came out this year about this. Strangely, with one is the same author, although they kind of are contradicting each other. So there is that idea that, yes, if you want to assess the impact of a removal technique, you need to take that approach of testing it, not only looking at the local impact, but how it actually plays out with the Earth system, and will it impact the ocean sink or the land sink. However, there are people that are starting to do that, like assuming, okay, we implement at scale, like gigaton of carbon per year, and the feedback was actually pretty small. So that idea that we need to look into this, I think it's true, but preliminary results seem to indicate that it's the feedbacks in the systems are pretty small, and then when you implement a strategy, it seems that that feedback is happening, but it's not a big feedback. And I think it's a good news, because if you need to ask people that are going to start implementing those mitigation strategies to talk to each other all over the world to, okay, I'm going to do this. What are you going to do? So I can see if mine is going to impact yours. And I think nothing is never going to happen. Your second question, what was the second question?
About the alkalinity and
organisms. So yes, there are definitely impacts, and this is something that needs to go in parallel with pilots. So there are already pilots of those things, and they're trying to assess impacts. Some of the impacts that crop up, that it seems that they will have an impact in some larval growth and mortality. So yes, that's something that definitely, especially because when you grind rock, there are actually other stuff in the rock that you put in the ocean and elements that might be detrimental. So, but those are definitely needed in parallel.
Okay, so there was a hand up over here somewhere I saw. But in the meantime, we have a question from online from somebody whose name is Emma Denez. I hope I pronounced it okay. Who's an early career journalist based on the Princeton area and also studying science writing. The Emma notes that they're very well aware of how frequently ocean carbon sequestration is portrayed incorrectly by the media about, for example, the whales. And the question is, how can a journalist as Emma and others, and people interested in communicating ocean science more generally, work to tell narratives that balance the ocean's ecosystem services with the intrinsic value of biodiversity? What is your advice as a scientist? Or as a person?
I guess it's a version of Paul's first question. So what are the biodiversity metrics that make sense? I mean, in the case of whales, fish, bottom trawling, I think there are actually obvious metrics that are showing that the impacts that it has and on the ecosystem without having to rely on carbon. And so I get the pull to always talk about carbon, but I think it's just we have to think a minute, does that actually make sense? And I'm not saying those systems or those fluxes don't exist. You saw fishing is removing carbon, trawling is emitting carbon. But it's just that if you look at them, it's a lot of grams of carbon. But if you put it back in the context, it's actually more smaller than the ocean sink. So it's often because those numbers are taken independently and not put back in the broader system, in the broader context.
Good. And it might be also a question for some of our professors thinking of, so Alison Carruth, and it may be worth talking. There was
She's raising her hand.
Okay. So maybe we'll riff with Alison here, and then there are more questions up front.
Since you said my name. Thank you so much, Laure. This is such an important
talk to be giving. And I really appreciate this point about the need for alternative narratives when it comes to the ocean. And I think we can think about charismatic megafauna who have dominated narratives about biodiversity. And I think we can also think about charismatic narratives, and global carbon and global warming have become the kind of key actors in certain charismatic narratives about the ocean. And now I think blue tech and the blue economy are sort of another more broad charismatic narrative. And I'm really curious, as somebody who's researching blue tech from the vantage of the humanities, what you make of some of the sort of proposals that we can scale kelp farming in particular at the surface, and then we can remove huge swaths of polymetallic nodules on the sea floor on behalf of the energy transition. I'm curious if either of those cases at the ocean surface and in the CCZ and the Marianas Trench have come into this analysis at all.
So I know better the seaweed surface question, and so I mean Danny here, for instance, we've been thinking about this, and he's working on this. I would say people are hoping that it would remove maybe about 1 gigaton of carbon per year, if at scale. That's the type of number. I don't think it can be bigger than this. Now the question becomes, how many platforms do you need to do this? And are you going to convert all your ocean into seaweed farming? And what would be the impact of this? And is it really a good solution? So I was saying, they have biological solution have a small impact because the sink is not biological, but you could see, well, if you start farming out a lot and you take care of that carbon and you sink it down, maybe you could have an impact. But I think, my personal, maybe Danny disagrees here. I'm looking at him, but to be really at scale, I don't think this is a viable solution. To be at 1 petagram of carbon scale. I guess this resonates with me with what people have thought about, those the fact that you need multiple solutions. That this is something that has been around for a long time. I'm looking for Rob here. That you need a portfolio of things, and so that might be part of the portfolio. My personal opinion is I don't think those biological solutions are easily scalable because of the impacts that they would have on ecosystems. But some people might disagree. I'm not saying it does. I'm just not sure.
Okay, so we have one question, like nearby questions, and then do we have nearby questions here?
So a question about increasing the alkalinity. You said we can possibly suck up around 1 gigaton of carbon. Like what spatial extent of the ocean? Like how much of the ocean area will we need? How long? And I mean, if it's $100 a ton, 1 gigaton, CO2, let's say we're talking about a few $100 billion. It's like less than 1% of the world economy. So I don't know, maybe you can comment of the space, how much of the ocean will we need, and how...
A lot. So 1 gigaton, I think, again, to me, I think it has kind of a upper bound of what can be achieved. Again, I'm not sure that's the right way of thinking about the climate problem. I think mitigation should be like the first thing we think about before planting seaweed farm everywhere, dumping alkalinity everywhere. But so for the alkalinity question, right now, I think the consensus is that if it can be 100-ish or less, it's maybe viable, and that's because if you compare it to the type of carbon taxes in markets, this is the price of the carbon markets in Europe. And so you could think, that then it can be bought as credit, right? In many places, it was more expensive than this, but you could say, well, when put at scale, maybe they can take it down. But there are other bottlenecks for ocean alkalinization, the fact that you need minerals. And so do countries all have the minerals? This one is based on carbonates, and there is no almost carbonate to mine in South America, in Africa, for instance. So, there are other bottlenecks. Then you need also to be able to put that carbonate into quicklime. So that's the same process as cement. And so most of those cement factories are in China, in the US, in Europe. but they are used for cements. But you could say, well, there is an opportunity when China is going to start to lower their production of cement, they could use those to do, to produce quicklime and do those type of. So there are opportunities there, but to put it at scale, I don't think we're there yet. But 100, to go back to the amount, $100 is kind of, that target where people think it's a viable amount.
So then we had that question there, and then I think Bob and Jimbo, and then that there, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Just have them hold their hands up again and it'll go better. Sorry, I have like 10 questions for you, but this is the one that I can put into words, so we're going to go with that one. With your model, I noted you were talking about the importance of the chemical motion of the chemical pump versus the biological pump. Mm-hmm. But I noted that the chemical pump didn't seem to end in sequestration. It seemed to just end with carbon moving deeper. And that kind of made me wonder, because wouldn't that eventually run out as the difference in concentration sort of eventually evens out? So
yeah, so those pumps, so depth, actually, you can almost equate it as sequestration. The deeper you put the carbon, that means I'm not going to say sequestration, I'm going to say stored, because sequestration has that connotation of offsetting emissions. That's not what I want to say here, but carbon, the deeper you put it, the longer it will take it to go back to the surface and in contact with the atmosphere. So actually, it matters where it is in the ocean. If it's at depth, then it's not in contact with the atmosphere. So any process that will take carbon from the surface and put it at depth will actually store carbon on longer time scale. Now to your question, it's not doing much, so it's just like looping around. It's looping, but actually that loop, what going down slightly exceeds what's going up. And so that's why you actually maintain a pump. Right now, today with the ocean carbon sink, more is going down than is coming up, and that's because we keep adding carbon in the atmosphere. That's where it becomes more difficult, is in the natural baseline. You could say, well, in the natural baseline, I'm going to just homogenize everything. But actually, that's why biology is so important, because that's biology that maintains the gradient. That's biology that pulls that gradient. It's because it takes up carbon at the surface, even if you have less carbon than it goes against the gradients. So it takes up carbon at the surface, and then when it dies, it just sinks and takes that carbon down. Whatever happens, it just take it down. So it actually maintains that gradient.
So would you agree with maybe those biological systems are more important when you're talking about like sequestration in the long term?
So sequestration really has that misleading tone that we think, we're sequestering carbon that we emit. I agree. So I agree with you. Biological pump is taking carbon and maintaining it at the depth. Without biology, we wouldn't have 38,000 gigatons of carbon stored in the ocean. Biology keeps that gradient. But that happened before we were here. That happened before we were emitting carbon. This is what the ocean does. And actually, even, there are, in Danny's group, they are working on the mass extinction, during the dinosaur extinction. And a large portion of the biology was, affected in the ocean. But even though there was still a lot of that biological pump going on, to kill that biological pump, even a mass extinction will never completely remove that biological pump. It's very strong. You can modulate it. I'm not saying that climate change is not going to change it at all, but it's a very robust feature of the system.
Thank you.
Okay, and so I'm looking at the time, and I'm looking at the number of questions. If we can keep them brief, why don't we have
keep it brief.
1, 2 questions at once, and then Laure can answer them briefly, and then we'll have 3, 4.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, Laura. I'm an Earth system modeler, and I've always been thinking about considering the river transport in the model, in the Earth system model, because, like as you mentioned, there's a mismatch. And how would you value this so-called maybe land, river, ocean coupling framework that would potentially help better constrain of the carbon climate feedback, and how may that impact, say, the estimate in the ocean sink?
Yeah. So I think it's a great thing that Earth system models are going towards having that connection between the land and the ocean in terms of carbon. Most of that loop that I showed is natural, so it's happening naturally. However, it's modified by humans, so it's slightly modified. So to have that coupling in the system, you need to have it not as a set diagnose. You actually need the processes to see how it's going to respond to human intervention. No, I think it's great that it's put in Earth system models now.
So you noted that despite their high density, the small area of blue carbon sinks makes them not a big player in the global carbon cycle. And so you can't sell blue carbon as the solution to the carbon problem. But if you flip it around, those exact same characteristics, along with the pricing that you laid out for carbon, means that they may be a very viable approach for financing blue carbon solutions with additional unintended or hard to monetize co-benefits. So as you separate them, is it fair to say that you almost want to flip the problem around to think of it the other way around as a justification for these things like mangrove restoration?
And I guess that's what people have been doing. They sell it per meter square. If you actually restore per meter square, you can have some carbon sequestered. I guess it's okay. Then you say, are you trying to sell carbon credits or are you trying to solve the climate problem? I guess that's the question. So if you're trying to sell carbon credits, then I think yes, you can do that. But I do think they are more valuable for what they bring to the biodiversity than for carbon, and that won't solve the climate problem.
So my question is, where are successful afforestation efforts happening in North America? And by successful, I don't mean just acting as a carbon sink, but also enhancing biological diversity and acting as a compelling narrative, catching hold of the public imagination.
Maybe you should talk to Allison for this. She probably knows more about those narratives. And Allison, do you have one that you want to showcase? It would be so much more interesting than if I'm trying to.
That's in production, so I'm not at liberty to share it yet. But I actually think much more hyper-local kelp restoration projects are an answer to that question, happening around the world, but including off the coast of California. Yeah. But it's happening at such a small scale, so we have to have a totally different mindset of how we value them.
But exactly, it's not about the carbon, it's about something else, right?
Okay, and so given the time, we're going to have our final question.
Hi, so I was kind of going back to the narrative question as well, but I know it can be difficult to get public and governmental interest in funding biodiversity conservation. But do you think that maybe the misconceptions that center carbon might actually be putting more attention towards biodiversity conservation, even if they're technically founded upon incorrect values?
Yeah, and I guess that's why that's done, because it attracts attention. However, if you look at the number closely, I think it's very risky, because then if you look at the number closely, you could end up concluding, oh, this is not worth saving. Who cares about 0.00 whatever? And yeah, so to me, yes, that's why people do it. But I think when you start looking closely, it's not the right argument. It's not the right narrative.
Thank you.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Laure again. And before you head out, pull up your calendars, because on Tuesday, December the 2nd, Professor Carla Staver, Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, will be giving us our final of the first 4 of the new Brigger Hall HMEI Faculty Seminars on fire responses to climate variability and implications for fire management. So, thank you.